So, you finally got that time machine up and running. Congratulations. But before you go punching in a date, you're gonna need to know where not to go, like the year 536, for example. It seems likely that the woes of AD 536 were kicked off by a single volcanic eruption, although we're not too sure about where it took place. It might have been Iceland, as ice cores from the Swiss Alps contain pieces of volcanic glass believed to be from the area. These fragments have been dated back to the spring of 536. That said, there's a strong argument that these shards aren't from Iceland after all, instead theorizing that the eruption might have happened elsewhere in Europe, or even as far away as North America. We're not going to get too far into the weeds here, but the moral of the story is that we do know that this was probably the mother of all volcanic eruptions. Eyewitness accounts from the time record an eerily dim sun, and we found evidence of ash-flecked ice cores and stunted tree ring sections across Europe. Even Chinese sources note that the city of Nanjing was blanketed by a strange dust in late 535. And while this may have been from an earlier form of the phenomenon now known as Asian dust, it was accompanied in the 6th century by widespread drought, famine, and snowfall in the summer months. We've even got evidence of more eruptions taking place after 536, suggesting that the 6th century was a real hotspot for volcanic activity. For example, some scientists have theorized that the Ilopango volcano in Central America may have erupted around 540. If true, this would have intensified the cooling effect that was already in place over the northern hemisphere. The ash and dust thrown up by the volcanic activity of the 530s caused the sun to vanish for a full 18 months, leaving much of Europe, the Middle East, and some portions of Asia living in low-light conditions. It probably didn't help that the sun was at a solar minimum at that time, meaning that its activity would have been at the lowest point in what tends to be an 11-year cycle. The people of the time noticed this, of course. The Byzantine historian Procopius wrote that, "A most dread portent took place, for the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during this whole year." Meanwhile, Roman politician and historian Cassiodorus wrote of extraordinary signs in the heavens. He explained, "The sun, first of stars, seems to have lost his wonted light, and appears of a bluish color. We marvel to see no shadows of our bodies at noon, to feel the mighty vigor of his heat wasted into feebleness." Cold temperatures and a lack of consistent sunlight might be bad for people, but it's catastrophic for plants. And when people depend on those plants for their food, rapid changes in the environment can quickly become life-threatening. In 536, crops across the world began to fail, which soon led to famines. The Irish Annals of Ulster note a failure of bread that year, a short phrase that nevertheless belies much suffering. Meanwhile, archaeological research from the American Southwest indicates that indigenous people there experienced food insecurity after temperatures dropped. Around this time, northern China was also hit by drought, hail, and floods that ruined crops and worsened the famines. The Moche people of Peru were also forced to weather severe crop failures. Things got so bad for them that between AD 500 and 700, they appeared to have engaged in mass human sacrifice in an attempt to forestall their destruction. 2 mass killings from the time appear to have involved sacrifices of around 40 people each. I feel like we don't need to explain this, but that didn't work, and the farmers at the time were about to find themselves in a whole new world of trouble. A 2014 paper published in the Danish Journal of Archaeology suggests that veil of dust thrown up in 536 could be linked not only to wild swings in weather conditions, but also the emergence of widespread ergotism. Ergot is a parasitic fungus that can install itself on vital cereal crops like wheat, rye, rice, corn, and oats. It also produces alkaloids that, when ingested by humans, can cause a number of varying symptoms depending on the exact strain involved. These effects include convulsions, hallucinations, gangrene, and death. Ergotism has since been linked to medieval episodes of convulsions and even mass panics, like witch trials. When ergot is sufficiently established, farmers might be able to spot evidence of it growing on their crops. They certainly knew about it at the time, as ancient Mesopotamians were complaining and writing about ergot-infected grains as far back as 600 BC. But if you were starving, would you take a risk on off-colored wheat if that's all you had to eat? As far as 536 goes, it's worth noting that rye crops would likely have proved to be the most resistant to the sharp drop in temperatures. Unfortunately, though, rye also happens to be an especially friendly host for ergot. The economy of the first millennium AD was about as fragile as you might expect, and in Europe, anything that affected the growing international trade markets could have significant ripple effects. Here too, we can learn a lot from ice cores. Research published in the journal Antiquity outlines a sampling of ice cores in the Colla Nifeti glacier of the Swiss-Italian Alps. There, scientists found a delayed drop in lead pollution, which had been long caused by the smelting of mined silver ore. Silver making had begun to decline when the ancient Romans pulled out of the region, but it seemed to take another dive in the mid-6th century. Researchers suggest that this was the result of economic pressure caused by both climate change and epidemics. Put simply, if people are forced to fight famines and plagues, they're less likely to spend money or refine silver. Meanwhile, in northern Europe, villages in Sweden appear to have been abandoned around this time, with those in the east and center of the region hit hardest. Archaeologists have also detected an increase in gold used for sacrifices around this time, hinting that people were more willing to give up their precious goods for the sake of salvation. This would have caused problems too, of course, as money tends to be more useful moving through the local economy than sitting at the bottom of a lake. If you lived through 536, the culture of the time may not have offered you much distraction from your woes. Norse tales turned outright apocalyptic, for example, with many focusing on the concept of Fimbulvetr, the season of cold that heralds the end of the world. Fimbulvetr is typically characterized by a weak sun, floods, and earthquakes. The Norse may well have attempted to use it as a way of grappling with the cataclysms of 536. It wasn't just the Norse who were bumming themselves out either. In British history, the first millennium is sometimes hard to tease out, as records tend to be inconsistent and filled with propaganda, but the iconic legend of King Arthur may have a connection with this era. Arthur is mostly associated with the chivalric romances of the High Middle Ages, but he's mentioned in both the 6th century Welsh poem Ygoddathin and the 9th century Historia Brittonum.
Ah, now we see the violence inherent in the system. Shut up! Oh, come and see the violence inherent in the system! Help, help, I'm being repressed!
What does all this have to do with 536? Well, King Arthur's legend has been linked to actual events that took place around this time. Social and economic pressures produced by crop failures and refugee movements in the region naturally led to conflict, and the location of many of these battles line up with those associated with Arthur in the Historia Brittonum. Famine leads to hunger, and hunger tends to depress people's immune systems, which in turn makes people more susceptible to disease. The historian Procopius mentions that in the 10th year of Emperor Justinian's reign, the veil of dust made its eerie appearance over Europe. Procopius adds, "And from the time when this thing happened, men were free neither from war nor pestilence nor any other thing leading to death." Michael the Syrian offers up an even more vivid account of life during the so-called Plague of Justinian. You know you've made it when they name a plague after you. The story goes that around 537, a plague hit Constantinople that claimed many thousands of lives. Michael claims that officials gave up counting after 300,000 people had died. He writes, "The trouble began with a wound that formed in the palm of the hand and progressed until the afflicted one could not take a step. The city began to stink, and so the bodies were thrown into the sea. The bodies kept resurfacing." Michael goes on to say that this disease soon spread to Egypt, Palestine, Armenia, and Persia. Modern researchers have pinned down the date of the Plague of Justinian to 541, just 5 years after the eruption of 536, and human remains from the time have shown evidence of infection by Yersinia pestis, the same bacteria that later caused the Black Death. Summer snows, withered crops, sluggish economies, ravenous plagues. What empire could stand against such an onslaught? Rome sure had a hard time of it. By the 6th century, the Roman Empire was already in trouble, having split into eastern and western halves in AD 395. That decision came about in part because it was becoming too difficult to manage one large empire, while the rise of the Persian Empire to the east necessitated having a second emperor to keep watch. Yet, as you might imagine, the eastern and western halves of the empire often bickered. The east mostly did all right for itself, eventually transforming into the powerful Byzantine Empire, but the west soon folded to exterior pressures. The effects of 536 surely didn't help much, with climate change contributing further to societal and administrative instabilities.
Death is in the order of things. Didn't they teach you that at school?
This sorry state of affairs eventually gave way to the Migration Age, which is otherwise known as the Barbarian Invasions. This was a period in which non-Roman peoples began moving into Rome's territories. In the first wave, Germanic tribes such as the Visigoths moved away from encroaching Huns. They took the city of Rome in AD 410. This was followed by a second wave of migrations beginning around AD 500 and continuing for a couple more centuries, resulting in yet more social upheaval right around the year 536. Other conflicts placed further pressure on Rome, such as Justinian's attempts to retake lost territory and the Gothic Wars, both of which only began to wind down in the 550s. Even when you put aside the violence, the famines, the cold, and everything else, everyday life was often dangerous for the people of the 6th century. For example, given that infant mortality is often estimated at 30% or more for the European Middle Ages, it's safe to guess that it hadn't been much better centuries earlier. Likewise, common folk from this era probably dealt with many of the same issues that plagued medieval people, which we might promptly address today, anything from heart problems to dental cavities. Maternal mortality was an especially dangerous issue at the time. A 2013 paper in World Archaeology looked at Anglo-Saxon graves in an England burial ground dating from AD 450 to 700, as well as others from that era. Researchers found evidence that, based on the number of women buried with infants, mothers may have died in childbirth at rates far higher than those we experience today. It's a stark reminder of the realities of life and death in the early Middle Ages, and as much proof as you'll ever need that nobody could escape the perils of the time.